Yeah. So we skip around the slides a little bit last class. We'll do it again today. We'll start with the market concentration stuff. I then kind of have a little bit to kind of probably go back and just think about monopolists and competitive for a bit, and then kind of transition that into something I think is just kind of broadly thinking about what we've been doing. So we've talked about these four different types of markets, right? Perfectly competitive, monopoly markets, monopolistically competitive, and then oligopolies, right? So you can think about it as we're moving from perfectly competitive to monopoly, things are becoming what we would say is more concentrated, right? That once you get to a monopoly, the concentration or all of output is from one firm, right? As you go towards a perfectly competitive market, you've got more and more firms splitting up the output across all those firms. It becomes less and less concentrated. So you think about this as, right, we can measure concentration ratios, which is just going to be for us the percent of the market's total output that's coming from whatever firm we're looking at. Now, when we look at that for every single firm and then add up the four largest firms, we'll kind of call that our concentration ratio. It's always going to be in kind of percentage form. Okay. So when you think about here, as you get a larger kind of what we call concentration ratio, or four firm concentration ratio, as it goes up, that's telling you that those top four firms own a larger percent of the, or kind of, I shouldn't say own, produce a larger percent of the total output in the industry. So maybe you've got one industry, and I don't know, the top four firms all have 10%, right, of the overall output. So there we would have kind of an overall kind of four firm market concentration ratio of 40%. What if I had a duopoly where both firms are splitting kind of output evenly, so each one has 50%? Well, then I would have this concentration ratio of 100. So notice, as I'm getting a larger concentration ratio, that's reflective that there's kind of fewer firms with more market power, right? In fact, what would the concentration ratio be for monopolists? It's kind of tricky. Yeah, 100%. So what's kind of interesting is that you can actually end up with a similar concentration ratio when you're four firm concentration ratio when you're looking at a monopoly versus a duopoly, right? Or just two firms. So it's a good measure, but it's not perfect because at the top, right, you can kind of see this value of 100, and you can imagine there could also even be a triopoly, which I don't, it's not often when you kind of use that terminology, but right, and this is 3.3 repeated for all these, where that would add up to 100 as well. So it's not a perfect measure, but it's kind of a good first look at things. Okay? So if we had a concentration ratio of 100%, that's going to give you multiple examples. We can't tell if it's a monopoly or a duopoly there if I just saw that four firm concentration ratio. But what I know is that there's at least four or fewer firms that own all of production, right? Or that make up total output. Okay. What would this concentration ratio get closer and closer to as I increase the number of firms? If we assume that it's kind of spread evenly across firms. Imagine like a really kind of wild scenario where there's like
profits.
Huh?
Would it be like overall profits? Because
so
another firm enters, profits go down because they're all sharing.
Yeah, so in the long run, if we had a perfectly competitive market with lots and lots of firms, profits got driven down to 0, right? So similarly, what would the concentration ratio in theory get driven down to?
0.
Yeah. Now, in practice, do we ever see that? No, because like even if you had 1,000 firms, right, 0.001, right, you're going to have something that's really small, but it's still going to be, you know, it's going to be close to 0, but it's still going to be something that's positive, right? But you get closer, you're approaching 0 as you get kind of this more competitive market. Okay. I shouldn't even put equal. I should say like in the limit, I guess it approaches zero. Right? So, you can kind of think about 1%, kind of if you want, because we know that it's going to be something above zero. If it's easier to think about like, a perfectly competitive market would have a concentration ratio of like 1%, or maybe even lower, depending on how many firms there are. Okay. So if I had an example like this, right? How can I, from data, right? So this is like 4 firms. How can I tell what the 4 firm market concentration ratio is? We're measuring this concentration ratio. We're just taking the percent of output from each of the top 4 firms. So here, I've got the top 4, and then I have how much every other firm in that industry is producing. So how am I going to get kind of these percent of overall output? The first firm has $22,408 in sales here. What would I need to know in order to turn that into the proportion of sales they have, or the percent of sales?
What overall sales?
Yeah, I need the total sales in that market. Well, how can I get the total sales in this market? Well, I've got the top 4 firms and every other firm in this industry. So it's really just a matter of adding all those up. Now I could break this down into every single firm and it would just be a little bit more complicated. I forgot to connect this in. Give me 1 second. So I don't have to keep walking back and forth to switch this over. So I basically would add all of those up. And then you can think about, I wanted to make this a little bit easier. Well, then the numerator would just be the top 4 firms. So I don't think this is the easiest way to think about it. The probably easier way to do this for me, I'm thinking about how I want to do this. I don't know what this value is at the top of my head. So we're going to use Excel to cheat, or someone with a calculator can tell me what this adds up to here. So I'm gonna copy. Luckily, I have Excel here. So I'm gonna paste that. Nope, these are all dollar amounts. It doesn't like that. If anybody gets it before me, feel free to let me know. I thought I had it. This is still treating this like it's oh, because I've got commas in there. Get there eventually. Didn't plan on doing this, so why the hell is this not hitting? All right, well, I'm gonna eyeball this here. So 22, 150, 175, so approximately 400 and some thousand. So if anybody wants to check me, if you add these up, I don't know, it's gonna be roughly, let's say, $400,000, right? That's kind of the total sales in this industry. What I would then do is take firm A, 22,000, what is it, 408?
450 on the bottom.
450? And I would just divide it by that total sales in the industry. Now, the problem is, if I divide 22,408 by 400,000, I'm going to end up with the proportion of sales. This is going to have to be something that's less than 1. So I don't know, everyone's math background a little bit different, but like, let's say, I don't know, anybody want to help me out? What does this end up being? 22,000 over 450,000. 4.9%. So 0.049 is what you would see in the calculator, right? So this will show up as 0.049. So when you're calculating the market share, when you're taking the total amount from that firm divided by the total amount of the industry, it's going to show you the fraction or the proportion of sales coming from that firm. So how can I turn that into a percentage? Yeah, how would you do that? Just move the decimal 2 places, or you multiply it by 100, right? So to kind of convert that proportion or that fraction of the overall sales from that firm into a percentage, you just multiply by 100 or move the decimal 2 places. Okay. And then once you did that for each of the top 4 firms, it's just a matter of adding up what those 4 percentages were. Now, kind of the trick is, if I think about, if I had this times 100, then I would do, what's the next one? 93,000-ish, 883. Right, I could write this all out at one time. Everything has the same denominator, everything's getting multiplied by 100. So I really could just add up the total output from the top 4 firms, divide that by the total, and then multiply it by 100. So you can kind of break this up firm by firm, or if it makes a little, it's easier to think about the other way, because you're dividing and multiplying everything by the same 2 values, the total output in the industry, and then times 100 to make it a percent. Well, your numerators there will just be whatever the top 4 firms sales were. Probably breaking this down into the 4 firms and then adding it up is probably easier for most people. I just kind of mentioned that we can kind of think about it like this as well. Okay? So if we have this market share at about 41%, that's going to tell us that it's fairly concentrated, right? But it's nowhere near 100, which tells us that if we have like an oligopoly going on, basically, right? Top 4 firms owning all of product. So we're pretty far away from that. So we're probably, this is probably a pretty competitive market. Maybe some monopolistic competitive competition going on. Maybe that's caused by branding or advertising, which we'll talk about here in a second. So I'll make this one a little bit easier. I'm not going to give kind of the totals of each one of these. I've actually calculated that market share percent for you. Okay. So hopefully this discussion that we've already had will make this one pretty easy, right? So here I've got 4 different operating systems, the top 4 kind of firms in the operating system industry. And then all other firms have about 0.1%. So if I wanted the 4 firm concentration ratio in this industry, what would it be, right? So you've got each of the 4 firms' market shares up there, and then all of the other firms kind of in that 5th category. Here, you don't have to worry about kind of dividing each firm's divided by the total because I'm giving you what their market share is in terms of percentages. Okay. So I'll give you a little bit of time to kind of work on this. Might need a calculator. Mathematically minded, probably don't need a calculator. It's pretty easy. Yeah. All right. Everybody get an answer in here. 36 of us here today. All right. 38. Everybody got their answer in? I'm gonna close this out. Okay. So all this 4 firm concentration ratio tells us is the percent of the top 4 firms own, right? All I should have to do is add up each of the top 4 firms' market share percent. If I do that, what do I get? 99.9. What was another probably easy way of doing this one instead of kind of going through all the math? Yeah, if I've got the top 4 firms here and every other firm only has 0.1%, well, that would imply the top 4 firms have to own the other 99.9%. Okay. So it's as simple as kind of adding up that market share of the top 4 firms there. On the exam or something, I might give you, instead of this catch-all category, maybe I give you 10 firms, right, and their different market shares. It's just a matter of identifying the top 4, adding up their market share percent. Okay. Any questions on that? All right. So another measure we have, a little bit more complicated. is this what we call HHI or Herfindahl-Hirschman index, right? I just call it HHI because it's way easier, right? So this is a better measure of market share. So that concentration ratio is a nice, easy, quick one you can calculate, and it tells you, tells you something, but you can't differentiate between a monopoly and a duopoly here. Right? So this HHI will allow us to do that. So all we're going to do in calculating the HHI is take every single firm's market share. So that's all S, like S1, S2, that's just the first firm's market share, second firm's market share, third firm's market share. We're going to square those and then add them all up. Right? So, if we have 100 firms, this might take a little bit of work, right? But if we had like 3 or 4 firms, this wouldn't be too bad, right? You can kind of imagine, what if I had a duopoly here? So that would mean that firm 1, think about the market share, right? So firm 1, maybe I should not use numbers. We'll call firm A and firm B here. They each own 50%, or they each have 50% of the total output in that market. What would the HHI be here? So 50 squared plus 50 squared, we're done, right? So this is what? 2,500 plus 2,500 or 5,000. Okay. So notice here we've got a duopoly, 2 firms, right? Well, what would the HHI be for a monopolist? I've got it up here in the slides, but a monopolist, so they're going to own 100% of total output. So when I square their market share percent, I get 10,000. So notice now this HHI allows me to see, oh yeah, I can differentiate now between duopolies and monopolies. In fact, I can go one step further. I could actually have a duopoly that looks like this, but instead of splitting market share, maybe one of these firms has better cost structure and they have more of overall output, right? Well, here, if I add these, it'd be what, 400 plus, no, not, yeah, wait. Yeah, 400 plus 6,400, so 6,800. Well, notice, not only can I differentiate between duopolies and monopolies, I can tell you if there's different types of market share breakdown even among duopolies, right? This duopoly, a little bit less concentration because they're evenly splitting it. So that number is going to be a little bit lower than when one of those duopolies has a larger percent of the owner of the overall output, or a greater than 50% of the overall output. Question? Oh no, you're good. So it's still kind of follows the same rule that the higher this HHI gets, it's telling us the more concentrated that market is, right? 10,000, got one firm that has everything, right? And then as we move towards 0, we're getting closer and closer to a perfectly competitive market. I say here that, it's not exactly 0, but it's going to be very close to 0 when we're looking at these monopolistically competitive and perfectly competitive markets, because there is some finite number of firms. So even if it's like, 0.1 squared and you add that up for however many firms there are, you're going to get a really small value. So it's not going to be close. It's not going to be exactly equal to 0, but it's going to be close to 0. Okay? So the closer to 0 we get for this HHI, the closer we're getting to a perfectly competitive market. And then as we move up, 10,000 is where it's going to be at its highest. Okay? But if we could do this for every single industry, we could then compare industries and say, okay, which of these look like they might be kind of an oligopoly or a monopoly, right? And which of them look more competitive, right? And we're thinking about we want to regulate monopolies. Well, maybe we'll use this as a way to kind of identify when there's markets that there's a small number of firms that have a little bit too much market power. Right? So I think actually these numbers, I think we have these, this is like the actual operating system breakdown. I think it's maybe a couple years old. I think it's 2018 or 19 is where I grabbed this from. You can kind of imagine I'm looking at this industry and I would come up with my HHI instead of my 4-firm concentration ratio. I mean, this is going to be, I don't know, roughly around 5,000 because I've got more than 2 firms, but really 2 of the firms have what? 95% of the overall output. So this is going to have a really high HHI, when it comes to operating systems for phones, we really see that there's a couple companies that have a lot of market power there. Right? Well, why is that bad for consumers? If I've got an industry. I've got an industry that has like, only a couple firms. Right? If they can differentiate their products and act like monopolistic competitive firms, so we kind of treated oligopolies and monopolistic competitive as different, right? But we said these duopoly firms can kind of coordinate their actions, act as a monopolist. So what we kind of end up with is they're able to kind of cooperate, right? Or differentiate their products enough where they no longer are going to kind of compete down to this price equal to marginal cost, right? They're going to have either act as a monopoly or coordinate their actions to act as a monopoly or differentiate their product enough to kind of have this monopolistic competitive market. They'll choose a lower quantity. Price that they're going to set is going to end up being higher. And so when we have really concentrated markets, that allows for firms to set higher prices, hurting consumers, right? Decreasing consumer surplus, creating some deadweight loss for society. We don't necessarily like to see these HA guys that are high, right? We would rather see these perfectly competitive markets. Those are better for consumers, right? And better for society overall in terms of total surplus is maximized as we can get closer and closer to this perfectly competitive market. Questions on that? So, if we just kind of look at it as some interesting kind of real world output here, but like video game consoles, like there's not a ton of variety there. There's only a couple major players. So if we're just looking at forward concentration ratios, this is like a market that has, very concentrated, or the firms have a lot of market power. You kind of move down. What's really interesting, credit cards here. So it's kind of weird to think about, but what's the price of a credit card? It's kind of weird, but usually the price of a credit card is probably kind of their APR they offer you. So they basically get away with setting a higher, so the credit cards, right? If you don't pay off what you put on them, you then have to pay a certain percent of that, right? So sometimes it's as high as like 20%. So if you don't pay your bill, you then have that bill plus 20% of that bill, right? So if that market is monopolized, I don't know if it's monopolized, it's not monopolized, sorry. Heavily concentrated, right? 99% in the top 4 firms, so it's Chase, whatever the top 3 are. They're setting these crazy APRs, so if you use a credit card and don't pay it off, you're going to be in debt to them for a lot more than if we had more competition going on in that place. So that was kind of interesting. Some of these other ones maybe aren't as interesting. Search engines, that would make sense that it's really high. And then kind of as you move further down, even automobiles, right? We've got some, 4 or 5 major players, right? So kind of all of these markets we're thinking about are pretty heavily concentrated, right? And the government probably watches the actions of these companies a little bit closer to make sure that they're not kind of exhibiting too much of this monopoly power, or at least government should be doing that. I'm somewhat pessimistic, but I thought this other one was kind of interesting. So you kind of think about beer producers. This has changed a little bit more in recent years. I think this is probably a little bit old. You can kind of see there's like 2 major players, like when it comes to beer production. So Anheuser was it Miller Coors and Anheuser-Busch. So what's kind of interesting is sometimes these firms will hide kind of their market power, right? So if we think about the reason why I put this one up here is we're thinking about like light beers. They're all the same. Like they're just all terrible. They all taste the same, right? Well, at least, okay, I'm sure someone has like, I don't know, a dying allegiance to, I don't know, Keystone or something. But the idea is that you're offering a very similar product. I think we can always agree on that. So we're thinking about a company like Miller Coors. It's almost built into their name, but they're actually hiding the fact that they own a very large percent of the overall market. So I broke it down by company here, but they kind of just create different branding, right? So they make not only Coors beer, they also make Miller, right? Well, why are they creating two products that are pretty similar? All they're doing there really is differentiating their products just a little bit. So now, let's assume that I even, I'm competing with all these other firms. I now have differentiated my products so that I can act like a monopolistically competitive firm because I now have differentiated products. I can do away with charging a little bit higher of a price. So by offering multiple products that I slightly differentiate, I can actually charge different prices for those different goods, right? I can kind of gain a little bit of monopolistic competitive power in this market. So Miller Coors, the company itself, makes about a quarter of the overall production. They've got several products underneath their umbrella. I think candy bar companies like Mars, right? That's what they do. They have like a gross percent of the overall market share for candy bars, but they've got several products. Well, why do they do that? Why wouldn't they just create what? Well, we've got different demand curves, right, for different types of taste, but also, even if I'm producing two goods that are otherwise very, very similar, if I just differentiate them a little bit, I can gain some monopolistic competitive power in that market. What else do you want to say? Oh, nothing here. Just kind of some more graphs that are kind of interesting to look at. But if we look at our major four players here for automobiles, all right, we've got the top four firms owning just over 50%. Pretty concentrated market, but probably not overly concentrated. Kind of thinking about this as we're moving more towards a more perfectly competitive market. Like for automobiles, we're probably getting a lot less monopoly power, and we're probably just seeing monopolistically competitive power, right? You know, the make and model of each one of these cars, like, you know, a Nissan Altima and a Volkswagen Jetta or whatever the comparable one would be. Very similar cars, they've just slightly different look, right? They're differentiating their products. So we don't have kind of like an oligopoly going on here. Probably looks something a little bit more like a monopolistically competitive market here, where firms are producing all this, you know, automobiles, right? And you can break this down in categories: trucks, SUVs, kind of sedans. They're all producing the same product, but they differentiate them a little bit, right? You know, different companies' cars look just a little bit different. Any questions over any ideas? Shouldn't be anything too crazy. With the operating system one, console market, just some different graphs. So I wanted to kind of bring something up that I heard this morning. Well, 20 minutes left. Do this and then I'll go through it. So let's go all the way back. Don't look at the screen. So I think we left off. I started kind of. Here we go. So when we're talking about these monopolistic competitive markets, I just talked about firms will try to differentiate their product. Yeah? So sometimes they'll kind of use advertising to do so, right? In fact, advertising, you can convince someone that you have a different product when it's in fact the same as its other substitutes, right? You know, when I'm thinking about, I know there's slight taste differences, but when you're talking about, like, think about all the money Pepsi and Coke dump into their ads. They're trying to convince you, whether or not it's true. Like I said, you might think they taste very different, but it doesn't matter. What they're trying to convince you of is that they are very different, right? Well, but that's what, so why are they spending so much money on their advertising? It's to convince you that their product is better, right? Or their product is different from the other very close substitute. Right? If you don't like the Pepsi Coke example, you can think of, what's another one? Gasoline. Right? Literally, that one, there's not an argument. Your car doesn't treat unleaded gasoline from a Shell station any different than it does from the Speedway. I mean, it's unleaded gasoline, right? It's weighted the same, it's regulated. So why do you see ads for these numbers? Why do they spend money advertising? They're trying to convince you their product is different. That they can offer you something, whether or not it's the experience when you walk into that gas station, or how easy it is. It used to be, they made it, a big deal when I was like a kid. Of like, well, you can pay at the pump now, right? You can use a credit card, but it used to not be like that, right? So they try to convince you, or they try to give you all these other attributes, which if you buy their product, it's different than the rest. They're trying to get some of that monopolistic competitive power. Okay. So, the problem is, you can kind of think about what's the real value, the social value of this, because in advertising, what's happening, maybe these are kind of moving from a perfectly competitive to a monopolistically competitive market. which then creates higher prices for consumers and more deadweight loss for society. So really, in theory, advertising, I mean, it's not great, right, in that respect. Because in advertising, all I'm doing is convincing some consumers that my product's a little different, I can get away with charging a higher price. I'm actually hurting consumers. Right? Not only am I hurting consumers that way, and think about all the wasted resources from these companies. If these companies weren't dumping all this money into advertising, maybe they could be creating better products. Well, if they create better products that provide people a higher marginal benefit or demand curve will go up, well, then we might actually see more consumer and more producer surplus if they would do that. But instead, they're wasting all this money instead of on research and development. Only thing about gas or gasoline companies or whatever it is, but like, this could be something like really important, like what's a major one? Like these automobile companies. So they didn't spend all the money in advertising, and they instead put it towards creating, cars that were better for the environment. We might have had electric cars 20 years earlier, right? Or we might have had hybrid cars, whatever it is, cleaner emissions 20 years earlier. But they're wasting all those resources on advertising. So, we can think about manipulating pace of advertising to get this monopolistic competitive power. And also kind of can impede competition, right? So this is the idea that they're no longer kind of trying to produce actually different products. They're just trying to convince you that they're different, right? And then allowing for those prices to be above marginal cost or those markups, which we don't see in the perfectly competitive market, right? The perfectly competitive market in the long run, price is exactly equal to marginal cost, no markup, zero. Now, to be fair, right, there's always two sides of an argument, right? So the other side is that, well, advertising actually does provide information to buyers, right? Some ads, you might not even know the product existed before, right? Inform buyers can more easily find and exploit price differences. So the more advertising that you see from, grocery stores, they put out all these flyers. Oh, well, now I've got a better idea about what these goods are being, what the price is at all these different stores. I can choose the one that has the lowest prices. So maybe advertising allows for consumers to actually find lower prices, right? That could be an argument. Maybe it promotes competition, right? It allows more companies to kind of get in the game and actually get their product, get their name out there, so that there is more competition within these markets, right? However, it's kind of interesting. It's a study that is looking across states where some states don't allow glasses makers to advertise, and I can't remember which states these were at. This is often an older study, so I'm sure some of these have now kind of moved away from that. But what they find is eyeglasses were more expensive in states where advertising was allowed, right? So when you had these people kind of dumping money into advertising, trying to convince people that their eyeglasses were better, in those states, we kind of saw higher prices as well. So this kind of would be, evidence that maybe advertising is not a good thing, right? It's hurting consumers, right? Maybe it is providing them with some information about what exists out there, what the prices are, but that's more than outweighed by the fact that it's giving these companies a little bit more monopolistic competitive power. In fact, it's another really good example of this that's like really sad, actually. What else? Maybe this is the Joe Rogan listener coming out. But what else is? I think that America is the only country that allows for advertising of a specific product. Pharmaceuticals, yep. Right, drugs, right? Really, European countries, they don't allow this, right? So what's happening when these prescription drug companies are advertising, getting videos, trying to convince you that their blood pressure medication is the best? They're just driving prices up. Like when we sit here and we complain about healthcare costs, and it's like, stop them from advertising, right? Also, where's all that advertising money could it go to? Research and development for better drugs, like less harmful drugs, right? But I don't know the world, so here we are. But that's the idea. We can start thinking about these issues, right? We can start to address some of these issues just knowing what we know about market power. Okay? So another, and I got a bunch of slides in here. I don't think we'll waste, or I'll spend time on it today. But it's very similar when we just think about branding. Advertising and branding have similar kind of pros and cons, and all branding does, you could be providing the same product and just throw a brand name on it. you're just driving up the price. You're convincing someone that that product is different than the others. Right? Now, there might be something, you could go a little bit deeper into that branding, like telling you about the quality of the good, maybe, right? Like reputation kind of effects there. But it's a very similar thing in terms of it does give those companies a little bit more market power, which is not good for consumers. So I want to talk about more reasons why I don't like the government. So I heard this morning, sorry. I guess right now, oil companies are making a pretty good killing, like their profits have been up this past year. So we think about why. So here we think about these oil companies. And let's actually kind of start out with, let's just assume for a second, because I can cheat and know that they're not quite perfectly competitive. There's a couple major players, so we can imagine we probably have a monopoly going on there. But let's just assume for a second, or marginal cost, sorry, that this is a perfectly competitive market and they just have to take the prices given, right? So marginal revenue that they're able to make on each unit they sell is just whatever that equilibrium price is, right, of oil. Okay? Well, in the long run, we know that profits will be zero and we'll be at this kind of minimum or average total cost. However, are we ever truly in the long run? Things are constantly changing. So what's happened in this past year, right, is that because of the restriction of oil coming in from places like Russia, and because of the increased demand for oil in that war, what's happened? Well, if I think about that market, what I just explained, there's been a reduction, probably a different color here. There's been a reduction in supply, but also an increase in demand. So what's that going to do to the equilibrium price of oil? And so before it was here, all this, I'm going to really draw this dramatic to get to the point across. So a huge decrease in supply, a really large increase in demand. You can kind of see that's driving my prices way up. Now, for quantity, it would depend on the relative size, right? They're both pushing quantity in opposite directions. But we're not concerned with the overall quantity of the market as much for what I'm going to talk about here, as the fact that, well, they both would drive the price up. Okay? So what happens for firms that were currently getting zero profits? Well, now there's this change in the market, right? The new price or the new marginal revenue curve they face is way up here. Excuse me. Where does, we'll call this Q1. Where does marginal revenue hit marginal cost now? Way up here. And now the price they can charge is above the average total cost. So we have this area that represents those profits, which is the quantity they're selling times the difference between price and average total cost here. So these changes that happened over this year have put supply down and demand up for oil. So what did that do? Drove the price of oil up. Now, there is free entry and exit, but there's huge fixed costs. You don't see a lot of new players in the oil industry, right? It's really a small set of firms. So I'm taking the most rosy kind of rose-colored glasses. Look at this, where it's like, let's assume it was pretty competitive. How could they maybe see profits? Well, we got the kind of restricted supply and increase in demand. Okay? So you see these profits, you're like, man, it's oil, greedy oil companies making all this money, right? Well, they could be operating under the perfectly competitive point where total surplus is still maximized for society, right? It could be that total surplus, despite them earning profits, is still maximized. Okay? Now, even if it wasn't, right? So let's now assume that instead that they've got some market power, right? So think about them, maybe just a monopolistically competitive market, or even at its most extreme, we can think about what if the oil market was monopolized? Because things like OPEC, where they try to coordinate their decisions so that they kind of act like this, like they hold true to these collusion agreements so they can act like a monopoly. So even if that was the case, right? and we had something like this. So if we've seen this increase in, and so maybe there were, I don't know, given the current demand, after that demand increase, maybe, so this is the price that they're charging, here's the quantity. I don't know, maybe it looks something like this, right? Where price is above average total cost, and they've got positive profits, right? So even if they're proving competitive, we see positive profits, but even if it was a monopoly, even if we were in the long run, we could see them have positive profits as well. The problem is, what they're talking about doing is, you know, it's like an easy scapegoat that, man, look at these evil oil companies, let's tax them, right? Let's start taxing them for their production because we want to eat into those profits, right? Those profits should be shared with everybody else, right? So what happens if I put a tax on this company? I'm going to draw this really extreme just to prove your point. But right, at every single quantity, their marginal cost is now whatever it was before, plus this new tax, right? So what do? Well, their new marginal cost, their new marginal cost, it's the marginal revenue curve here. They restrict quantity even more, and they increase prices. So by taxing these oil companies, yeah, you are eating into their profits. In fact, the way I drew this, right, price is exactly equal to average total cost, right? So if I tax them enough, I could get them to choose that new profit maximizing quantity. We'll kind of call this Q2 here. They'll go up to the demand curve. Okay, the new price they're charging exactly. Okay, great. Oil companies have just no profits anymore. We've done a good thing. Have we? Well, deadweight loss before was right here. Now it's up here. And also, what's happened to consumer surplus? It used to be here. Now it's just that, right? So when we see positive profits, the instinct shouldn't be, let's, if we don't like those companies because they're very large, it shouldn't be it's like start taxing them. That's actually going to hurt people more. Yeah, you're going to hurt the company, but you're hurting people just as much, right? Yeah, good for you. Drove the profits down to zero. Now everybody's going to have to pay more at the pump, right? So we can kind of sort of think about things that we hear in the media through the lens of what we now know about these markets and kind of think about how government actions might impact it as well. So I probably wouldn't put you as far on the exam as to do like tax changes with a monopoly market, but we can start to see like things that we're learning if we can combine them. I don't know, you can come up with some pretty good insights as to what's going on in the world around us. What would be maybe a better way if I wanted to eat into oil profits and lower the price for consumers? I could set a price ceiling. I'm not saying the government doesn't have any use. I'm just saying they don't use the right tools often, right? Instead of taxing, let's put a price ceiling, kind of drive this price down lower, increase consumer surplus, increase total surplus. And yeah, maybe we don't drive those profits down to zero. So you can imagine, like, let's say I set this price ceiling right here so that I get to the point where marginal cost hits the demand curve. So total surplus is maximized, right? And profits are still positive, right? So it's, I don't know, it's just always interesting to me that like the government doesn't use tools that could actually make things better, and they instead talk about things that sound good, like taxing these rich oil companies, which would actually make things worse for us. Right? Wouldn't be bad for the government, because if they tax oil companies, what do they get? A bunch of tax revenue. Right? So that's my rant for today. We'll kind of do some reviews, go through some of those practice problems in class on Friday, getting ready for that exam in class on Monday. Okay.